Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Moby Dick, a Freudian whale of a time. The mighty whales which swim in a sea of water and have a sea of oil swimming in them. Thomas Fuller, The Holy State and the Profane State. Hey everybody, and here we have a suitably phallic thumbnail of the great white whale itself. And what I wanted to do today was pursue the links with Freud's psychoanalytical work and Moby Dick to argue or to try and explain why I think the novel has had such a profound influence. Even though it isn't that popular with lots of people in today, nearly everyone's heard of it. And also, I just think it's all the way through our culture. So in the live stream we did, I think Darren F. McGee was talking about how it's a theme. Captain Ahab is a theme in Star Trek even. So it's absolutely interpolated throughout our society, Moby Dick. And I wanted to explore this particular idea. I quite like this thumbnail because it gives you a sense of apart from the phallic image, there's the depths of the dark, huge, immense ocean. Whereas you can see the way the image is designed, the actual sky is a very small percentage of the overall picture, so the depths of the sea are conveyed. And what I'm going to use that for is a metaphor for the depths of the human imagination. So it's a novel about the vast depths of the ocean, but it's also a novel about the vast depths of human imagination, our instincts and our drives. And to illustrate and explore that aspect of the novel, what better than psychoanalysis, which is all about our unconscious and subconscious. So, interestingly, Moby Dick, given that it was written in 1851, Herman Melville couldn't have had any knowledge of Freud's work specifically, because Freud's first academic published piece came out in 1877, Moby Dick 1851. But out of interest, it was I'm trying to remember what it was. It was about the nervous system of the European eel. Was Freud's first academic paper, and probably that in and of itself is Freudian. But quickly moving on, what I find interesting is that great novelists often capture the zeitgeist ahead of anyone else. So I'm going to argue that Moby Dick, whilst it wasn't explicitly, because it couldn't have been about Freudian ideas, it actually captured a part of the zeitgeist ahead of its time. And some of the ideas Freud pursues, and in particular one of his students, Sandor Ferenczi, which I'll show you in a second, I think the novel illustrates or could be a resource better understood by psychoanalytical ideas. And if you don't like psychoanalysis, I'd ask you to stick with me, because this was a fun video to do. It doesn't have to be scientific. It doesn't have to be absolutely true. I just think psychoanalysis, when it's applied to literature, because no real people are being harmed, it just offers a different perspective, and it offers some really interesting angles. So that's what I'm going to be pursuing. So to give you an illustration, Sandor Ferenczi, he wrote this book, Thalassa, A Theory of Genitality, in 1924. And to reiterate, I'm not going to be referring to Freud a lot, but I will be referring specifically to this work, which follows Freud's teaching quite closely. Ferenczi and Freud fell out later on over differences of opinion. I think psychoanalysis can become a bit like religion. There are various dogmas and creeds that people follow. But in the early stage, 1924, I don't think they had fallen out, and Ferenczi quotes Freud positively. And I think this Thalassa book quite closely follows Freud's teaching. So I don't think it's stretching the truth to say that Thalassa is a Freudian book. And it's based upon, for some people, an idea that might come across as mad as a box of frogs, but it's the idea that as human beings, first of all, as a species, I'll be talking about the difference in later on phylocentric and phylogenetic and ontogenetic. Phylogenetic is about the study of evolution from a species perspective, and ontogenetic is about what happens to the individual organism or a person. So Ferenczi argues at the phylogenetic, at the species level, we originally all came from the sea. And over millions of years, the lungfish first, there were massive tectonic plate shifting and all sorts. So even Mount Everest used to be at the bottom of the sea. So all this earth is pushed up in this catastrophe for some animals, because all of a sudden you're in the sea and the environment changes and there are large tracts of land. And the lungfish and others amphibians are these like intermediate animals that were adapted both to water and oxygen and the outside air. And over time, obviously, mammals evolved, and there's the whole complex history of evolution. But for the purposes of Moby Dick, what's interesting is the whale is a creature that is a mammal. So we all came from the sea, and over millions of years, the whale evolved to go back into the sea. So from that point of view alone, the whale is an intriguing creature, above and beyond the fact that it's such a vast creature. And as was mentioned in the epigraph by Fuller, the idea that there's a sea of oil within this creature. So the sea of oil refers to spermaceti, which is this waxy, white, viscous liquid, which is in the head of the whale. And it's why sperm whales were hunted. They were particularly valuable because this spermaceti was used as a heating oil and a lighting oil. It gives off no smoke and it's very luminescent, so it was much prized. But for the whale itself, it's used as two main things. One for buoyancy or to submerge itself, and the other thing is for echolocation. So as echolocation, water's a unique medium. Well, it's different to air, and sound will travel through water much further distances than air. So it's interesting. I think a lot of us think of the ocean as a silent place, when actually for whales, they hear an awful lot. So that's going on in this weird reservoir of oil in their heads. These huge creatures that are within these immense, vast expanses of ocean themselves. There are these layers within layers of these ocean-like or liquid-like reservoirs. And then to add to all of this, Sandor Ferenczi's main argument is that because we came from the sea originally, millions and millions of years ago, our biological unconscious is such that at some level we're all trying to get back in the sea because that's where we came from. That's what gave us peace. So that's at the phylogenetic level. That's at the species level. But at the individual level, which is mirroring what happened at a species level, we all initially were a fetus in a amniotic sac of our mothers. No worries in the world, temperature controlled little container that we're in. We're fed. We don't have any responsibilities. We're just sleeping and occasionally kicking, I guess. But it's a very, if you imagine it, it would be the ultimate of peace and tranquility. And then when we're birthed, when the birth occasion happens, we're thrust out into these peristaltic thrustings of the woman in labour, and we're thrust out into this harshly lit place, the world that's foreign to us. Previously we've been this aqueous dwelling little baby, and suddenly we're thrust out, and then we meet the midwife, and to get us breathing we got our arse, or sorry, that's not a technical medical term, we get our backside spanked. And I think, was it Bernard Manning or Les Dawson, were old British comedians, used to have a joke. I wouldn't say you're ugly, but when you were born, the midwife turned around and slapped your mother. But there's this idea, it's a threatening, it's a traumatic experience, even though we consciously can't remember it. Ferenczi is suggesting, and the Freudian perspective is, deep within us, we have these drives that are trying to achieve some type of peace. And with reference to Moby Dick, to drag it to relevance to Moby Dick, you have this Captain Ahab, who arguably has never come to terms with having been born, because he's constantly raging against. He's got this undistinguished irritability, which I relate to. He's constantly irritable, and he's constantly berating God who put him on this earth. And Ferenczi's idea of deep down within our biological unconscious, we do this, I think can be used to psychoanalyze Captain Ahab himself. But if, rather than try and convince you, I just wanted to show you matching quotes from initially Moby Dick, then Ferenczi, and then I'll finish off again with Moby Dick, and to try and splice all this together. So this is at the very beginning of Moby Dick, in it's amidst the collection of quotes that Melville uses. So the world before the flood. In the free element beneath me swam, floundered and dived, in play, in chase, in battle, fishes of every colour, form and kind, which language cannot paint, and mariner had never seen. From dread Leviathan to insect millions peopling every wave, gathered in shoals immense like floating islands, led by mysterious instincts through that waste and trackless region, though on every side assaulted by voracious enemies, whales, sharks and monsters, armed in front or jaw, with swords, saws, spiral horns or hooked fangs. Now there's a couple of reasons I wanted to use this quote. The first is, I think it's really beautifully appropriate, this phrase, led by mysterious instincts through that waste and trackless region. Given that I'm going to be using psychoanalytical ideas from Freud and Ferenczi, you can see how, just by the quotes that Melville is choosing to preface his whole book with, he's making analogies to the vast oceans, the sea, the physical sea out there, but also mysterious instincts, that waste and trackless region, which could also be applied to our imagination, the human mind, the unconscious, the subconscious. And then why I think this is a very cleverly chosen quote at the very beginning is that it bookends, so to speak, the end of the novel. Plot spoiler, but in the epilogue, Ishmael is floating in the sea in Queequeg's coffin that's been thrown up out of the Pequod. And it mentions, as Ishmael, like some biblical characters floating in the sea, creatures like sharks that normally would attack just leave him alone, quite unusually. Where here you see, at the beginning of the book, though on every side assaulted by voracious enemies, the whole book is about the confrontation of Ahab and the whole whaling fleet against whales, but also man against man, human being against human being. And it contributes to the dreamy end, the epilogue, where Ishmael, by contrast, is floating, again, a bit like in the amniotic sac in the womb. And he's unworried, he's not attacked, he's just left alone. And I wanted to talk about the notion of whales themselves, because they are just incredibly interesting creatures. So this is a book, and it's weirdly portrayed because it's almost as a children's story collection. But actually, it's quite a complex book about evolutionary biology. And this chapter, in particular, that I'm going to show you some images from, is called The Higgledy-Piggledy Whale, Leviathans Walk, Paddle and Gallop to the Sea. And the basic thesis in this chapter is based, on biological scientific facts and fossil records. The idea that whales as mammals went back to the sea. We all came out of the sea originally, lungfish and amphibians and the whole of the evolutionary process leading up to human beings. But whales, millions of years ago, in evolutionary terms, were mammals who went back to the sea and adapted and learned how to live in the sea. So right from the get-go, whales are fascinating creatures because they're mammals. They have a similarity to us. And yet, they're such weird, huge creatures. And that is one of the ongoing themes of Moby Dick, is they're uncannily huge and odd and different, and their environment is the ocean, an environment that isn't friendly to human beings. So the people on the ships are constantly battling the elements. The elements favour Moby Dick, the great white whale, and all whales. It's their environment, not ours. But we have a shared mammalian ancestry. And Moby Dick is a character in and of himself. But I'm just going to give you a few images contained within this chapter that show you the actual, in DNA terms, the ancestors of whales, which sounds, bizarre and ridiculous. But here you have this little, rodent-like creature. And then you have, much further down the track, this paddling proto-whale. It's weird, isn't it? It's like half shark, hints of whale, but it's got a tail and legs and arms, webbed feet. Is it a duck? Is it a duck-billed platypus? Is it a mammal but doesn't really has a very odd head, and so on? And then you get much more whale-like, but still you see the little vestigial arms and tiny little legs at the bottom. So these tiny little hind limbs. But all of this is just to show, because I'm going to start talking about the notion of the biological unconscious. So when Ferenczi, drawing upon Freud's work, talks about the biological unconscious, if it sounds extreme and speculative and a bit mad, we'll just think in purely scientific terms. Those three images I've just shown you, the actual evolution of the whale, how truly bizarre that is. So maybe it would make you more sympathetic to Ferenczi's ideas of a Freudian insight into what lies deep down in our biological unconsciousness as human beings. So this is chapter 1, Loomings from Moby Dick. So there now is your insular city of the Manhattoes, belted round by wharves as Indian isles by coral reefs. Commerce surrounds it with her surf. Right and left the streets take you waterward. Its extreme downtown is the Battery, where that noble mole is washed by waves and cooled by breezes, which a few hours previous were out of sight of land. Look at the crowds of water gazers there. So right from the get-go in the first chapter, he develops this idea that we have this obsession with looking at water. And as we'll see, Ferenczi argues that, well, that's where we came from. We have this atavistic primeval attraction to water. Circumambulate the city of a dreamy Sabbath afternoon. Go from Corlear's Hook to Quenty's Slip, and thence by Whitehall northward. What do you see? Posted like silent sentinels all around the town, stand thousands upon thousands of mortal men, fixed in ocean reveries. So if you could remember that phrase, ocean reveries, I think when we talk about Freud and Ferenczi's concept of the subconscious, the imagination, the biological unconscious, I think the way in which Melville identifies really early on in the novel this concept of ocean reveries is quite important. Why, upon your first voyage as a passenger, did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration? when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity and our own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without meaning, and still deeper the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. So I just think this is Melville's drawing upon, ancient Greek mythology of Narcissus. Because he could not grasp the tormenting mild image he saw in the fountain. And I did Narcissus a couple of videos way back in the channel. But this fixation we have with water and its reflection, and the whole myth of Narcissus is about the ungraspable nature. He didn't know it was his own reflection. And it's this ungraspable, the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. So Melville's just describing in brilliant literary terms why we might have this weird sense of a mystical vibration, he calls it. And before the previous quote, the ocean viewers. But wherefore it was that after having repeatedly smelt the sea as a merchant sailor, I should now take it into my head to go on a whaling voyage. This, the invisible police officer of the fates, who has the constant surveillance of me, and secretly dogs me, and influences me in some unaccountable way. He can better answer than anyone else, and doubtless my going on this whaling voyage formed part of the grand programme of Providence that was drawn up a long time ago. It came in as a sort of brief interlude and solo between more extensive performances. I take it that this part of the bill must have run something like this: grand contested election for the presidency of the United States, whaling voyage by one Ishmael, bloody battle in Afghanistan. So there's a couple of things to say here. One is, again, please remember this: the invisible police officer of the fates is the constant surveillance of me and secretly dogs me and influences me in some unaccountable way. That is almost a description of the subconscious or the unconscious, or, as we'll see with Ferenczi shortly, this Freudian idea of the biological unconscious. These things that control us, despite the thing we always think as human beings we have autonomy, we have conscious decisions to make. But again, very early on, chapter 1, Melville's pointing out this grand programme of Providence. And probably relevant to this is the fact he was a son of I think he was a Calvinist minister. So within Calvinism, there's this strong notion of predestination. But the predestination being implied in this from a theological point of view, as we pursue Ferenczi's idea of the biological unconscious, the phylogenetic, the idea of how the species evolves, I think that's an interesting parallel that can be seen between the two. I think, again, hints of what Ferenczi's saying are evident here. And just finally, this idea that for each individual person, obviously your own, he's sandwiching whaling voyage by one Ishmael between world events. And this is the idea of the world of just this huge ocean of events. And we're just lost within that ocean. But our own particular story is obviously crucially important to us. But generally, it's lost within the ocean of events that encompasses the whole world. I am tormented with an everlasting itch. You can get tablets for that. For things remote. I love to sail forbidden seas and land on barbarous coasts. Not ignoring what is good, I am quick to perceive a horror and could still be social with it, would they let me, since it is but well to be on friendly terms with all the inmates of the place one lodges in. By reason of these things, then, the whaling voyage was welcome. the great floodgates of the wonder world swung open, and in the wild conceits that swayed me to my purpose, two and two there floated into my inmost soul, endless processions of the whale, and mid most of them all, one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. So I'm arguing that the novel is an exploration of the ocean seas. That's its explicit theme. But more metaphorically, those oceans and seas represent the human imagination, the human subconscious. So the floodgates of the wonder world swung open, floated into my inmost soul. So deep within every single human being is this vast expanse of our personal imagination, our own hidden story. And then, almost as a representative of this notion of the biological unconscious that Ferenczi develops from Freud's work, the one grand hooded phantom. So just like Narcissus looking in the pool and seeing this phantom of life, Moby Dick represents this phantom of life as one grand hooded phantom, like a snow hill in the air. So I'm jumping around, but I'm just trying to give you some context before I look into Ferenczi's psychoanalytical work. So this is chapter 87, The Grand Armada. And I'm going to claim this is representative almost of Ferenczi's idea of when you're in the womb as a fetus, a baby, the amniotic sac. So what's happened here is that the ship, they've been pursuing killing whales, but they chance upon this weird halcyon idyllic scene in the middle of the ocean. It's preternaturally calm, and there are all these whales that were previously unaware of the massacre taking place, and they're just, as described here, and thus though surrounded by circle upon circle of consternations and affrights, in other words, the whale hunting that's on the outskirts of these big pod of whales, did these inscrutable creatures at the centre freely and fearlessly indulge in all peaceful concernments, yea, serenely revelled in dalliance and delight. But even so, amid the tornadoed Atlantic of my being, do I myself still forever centrally disport in mute calm, and while ponderous planets of unwaning woe revolve around me, deep down and deep inland, there I still bathe me in eternal mildness of joy. So again, I'm arguing this is prefiguring what we're going to see with Ferenczi in a second. This is Ishmael describing his own sense of inner peace and calm that he strives for. I still bathe me in eternal mildness of joy. I think this is a great description of what Ferenczi, drawing from Freud, is trying to describe as the regressive tendency we have to want to return to the calmness of the womb. So this is Thalassa. This is all now. All of the subsequent quotes until we get back to Moby Dick are from Ferenczi's work. So if now we survey the evolution of sexuality from the thumb-sucking of the infant through the self-love of genital onanism, fiddling with yourself basically, to the heterosexual act of coitus, and keep in mind the complicated identifications of the ego with the penis and with the sexual secretion, we arrive at the conclusion that the purpose of this whole evolution, therefore the purpose likewise of the sex act, can be none other than an attempt on the part of the ego, an attempt at the beginning clumsy and fumbling, then more consciously purposive, and finally in part successful, to return to the mother's womb, where there is no such painful disharmony between ego and environment as characterizes existence in the external world. So this is, I hope you can see from the contrast with the previous quote from Moby Dick, why I think he's describing in some ways what Ferenczi is arguing here is an unconscious drive of human beings to want to get that type of calmness back. So this is chapter 3. Stages in the development of the erotic sense of reality. So the human being is dominated from the moment of birth onwards by a continuous regressive trend toward the re-establishment of the interuterine situation, in other words, being in the womb, and holds fast to this unswervingly by, as it were, magical hallucinatory means, by the aids of positive and negative hallucinations. The full development of the reality sense is attained, according to this conception, only when this regression is renounced once and for all, and a substitute found for it in the world of reality. This development is experienced, however, by only a part of the personality, in sleep and in dreams, in the sex life and the life of fantasy. The striving towards the fulfillment of that primordial wish is still clung to. So the bits I've highlighted, I think, point towards my argument that literature can be seen almost as the womb of the imagination. So, why do idiots like me constantly argue for the importance of literature? But it's being truly absorbed in a story, a narrative, a great literary work of art. I really do think it relates to this concept of how we as human beings relate to a sense of reality. So the full development of the reality sense is attained, according to this conception, only when this regression is renounced once and for all. So Ferenczi, drawing upon Freud, is saying we deal with reality by substituting our desire for the calmness of going back to the womb. And we'll see how that substitute for the world of reality, in the case of someone like Captain Ahab, he has a monomaniacal approach that, depending on how you view Ahab, can be seen as ridiculously overcompensating, or he's facing reality more than most of us are prepared to. So most of us, according to this, find magical hallucinatory means of avoiding having to confront reality. And arguably literature works as a halfway house. It helps us manage our engagement with reality, but in an imaginative way. But this magical hallucinatory means isn't viewed by Ferenczi particularly in a negative way. He's pointing it out. It's a coping mechanism that people need. And what's fascinating about Ahab is the way he just, rather than engage in this type of finding a substitute, he confronts reality face on. Now we have chapter 5, genital functioning in the individual. It's getting interesting. According to the conception here presented, the procreative function thus concentrates a whole series of elements of pleasure and of anxiety into a single act. The pleasure of liberation from disturbing stimuli of instinctual origin, the pleasure of return to the maternal womb, the pleasure of happily accomplished birth, and the anxiety, on the other hand, which has been experienced in the course of birth, and that which one would necessarily feel in connection with the fantasized return to the womb. Since the actual return is limited to the genital and its secretion, whilst the rest of the body can keep itself unscathed and takes part in the regression hallucinatorily, every element of anxiety is successfully eliminated in orgasm, and the procreative act terminates with a feeling of complete satisfaction. So Ferenczi is arguing that the pleasure of liberation from disturbing stimuli of instinctual origin, we'll see in a second how this relates again to Ahab, because the idea is that without things like, where are we, he's using the specific example of the sexual act as a way of getting rid of, in the act of procreation, there's a release the libido releases itself. And then in the actual act of sex, with the emission of semen, what happens is that finds, or like a fish, tries to travel to the womb to fertilize the egg. So that's the act. The act of sex is, we'll see later, has these symbolic references to fish swimming in the sea. But then you've got the trauma of the I think if this is only a man could write this, the pleasure of happily accomplished birth. Yeah, afterwards, I'm not sure. Even shortly afterwards, the woman just finds this a pleasure of happily accomplished birth. There is the huge amount of pain, but then all of the endorphins kick in. And I think I remember reading somewhere, and please tell me in the comments if I've got this wrong, but that you get the woman after giving birth gets this massive rush of endorphins. And over time, the body almost trains itself to forget the painful horror of having given birth so that you could ever have another baby. The idea is, psychologically, if you did remember how painful it was, you'd never have another one. So the brain and the body basically work together to delude you. But this, on the other hand, which has been experienced in the course of birth, and that which one would necessarily feel in connection with the fantasized return to the womb. So the anxiety is from the child's point of view. Being born is traumatic and horrendous. But the only way in which you can even approach, so that for the rest of your life, the idea is that the baby, as it grows, is trying to find substitute ways to return to the womb. So again, literature could be seen as that, one of these substitute activities that gives you a sense of immense oceanic calmness. But purely in terms of the sex act, the idea of the genital and its secretion, that gets to reenact the whole procreative struggle, whilst the rest of your body only takes part in this notion hallucinatorily, in other words, psychologically. So it's a whole way of seeing. It's Ferenczi's quite imaginative interpretation of both birth and the thing that gave rise to birth, the sex act, as mediated forms of trying to return to the womb. And this is the difference between the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic. So the phylogenetic refers to the evolutionary history, or the family tree of a species of organisms, of a group, whereas the ontogenetic refers to the individual organism. So the point of departure for all the speculations which follow was, it may be stated at once, the extraordinary frequency with which, in the most varied creations of the mind, both normal and pathological, in the products of the individual and the collective psyche, both the sexual act and the interuterine situation are expressed by the symbol of the fish. That is, the depiction of a fish moving or swimming in the water. Now, it happened in connection with a particularly impressive observation of this kind that the fantastic idea leapt to mind as to whether, over and above the purely external similarity between the situation of the penis in the vagina, the fetus in the uterus, and the fish in the water, there may not also be expressed in this symbolism a bit of phylogenetic recognition of our descent from aquatic vertebrates. So Ferenczi's symbolism is going to be a theme I'm going to talk about shortly. But the symbol of the fish, and what could be, I know it's a whale and not strictly speaking a fish, but talk about the biggest symbol of the fish imaginable, Moby Dick, which is particularly appropriate given what he's talking about here. The phylogenetic and it is interesting why Melville chose that title, given when you read this type of sex-based analysis, how it all, I was going to say fits together, but you know what I mean. But this phylogenetic recognition of our descent from aquatic vertebrates, what is Ferenczi's constantly, I was going to say banging on about, you've got to be really careful, you just open a minefield of euphemisms. But this notion of phylogenetic recognition, it sounds, this is why I pointed out when you saw the images of how ludicrous going from a little rodent rat creature to the evolution of the whale itself. That just sounds mad. But you saw the genetic evolution. And this is the opposite direction. He's going backwards, Ferenczi. And he's saying, deep, deep down, we have this phylogenetic recognition, or another way of saying it is biological unconscious. We have some remnant, like those tiny little hind limbs on that whale-like creature. We have these little vestigial, symbolic elements of what we used to be deep, deep within us. And this is quite a nice, neat summary. What if the entire intrauterine existence of the higher mammals were only a replica of the type of existence which characterized that aboriginal Piscean period, and birth itself nothing but a recapitulation on the part of the individual of the great catastrophe which, at the time of the recession of the ocean, forced so many animals, and certainly our own animal ancestors, to adapt themselves to a land existence. Above all, to renounce gill breathing and provide themselves with organs for the respiration of air. So that's Ferenczi's summary of his whole mad theory. But again, just to re-emphasize, the direction of travel he's describing as human beings originally, we left the ocean, or, millions of years ago, our evolutionary ancestors. But just to repeat, the whale is a fascinating creature because the whale headed in the opposite direction in evolutionary terms. It went back into the sea while still using air to breathe. So the implication of all this in Freudian terms, this is footnote. Yeah, this is a footnote from Ferenczi. I think it's chapter 7. So it's this interesting concept in Freudian psychoanalysis, the drive. The word instinct or impulse or drive in German Trieb tends to emphasize the factor of adaptation, the purposeful element in organ activity. The expression trend, Zug, more the regressive element. I am of the opinion with Freud that which seemingly impels forwards obtains its energy in the last analysis from the force of attraction of the past. So I wanted to highlight this because it's this paradox that what drives us forward is actually the call of an atavistic, hugely millions and millions of years ago past. And that's crucial, I strongly argue, for the end of Moby Dick. And plot spoiler, but Ahab being ejaculated into the sea, from whence never to return. So he's driven, Captain Ahab is driven with this absolute monomania. He's always driven forwards, always driven to confront. But actually, from this interpretation, if you applied Ferenczi's and Freud's interpretation to the behaviour of Ahab, Ahab is basically responding to the most primeval call of all, to go back to the sea from which we came. And I love this concept of undifferentiated irritability. So I've put Ahab's undifferentiated irritability, but this is my base level emotion on most days. So this is chapter 8 of Ferenczi, the view formulated by Freud of the tendency dominating all organisms to arrive at a state of absence of irritability. I missed that bit. And finally, the inertness of the inorganic world. And this is what the death instinct is misunderstood by many people in German, the Todesstrieb. It's not the idea that we actively want to die. It's more this concept of the absence of irritability, the total peace, the inertness of the inorganic world, the womb from which we came, in which we were at perfect peace. So this is from a footnote, but I found it really useful to understand all this. Inhibition mechanisms he's referring to. Primitive, undifferentiated irritability, me, is overlaid by reflex irritability of a specific order, and this by the psychically conditioned choice of reaction. I'll explain all this in a second. In pathological conditions and other deviations from the normal, such as deep hypnosis or the behaviour of a fakir, like an Indian mystic, however, the psyche suspends its functioning and the organism regresses to the stage of reflex irritability, or even to that of undifferentiated irritability. So what all of this is relevant to Ahab, because in some ways he's a purer human being. Ahab has stripped away from himself all the mechanisms being described here, the inhibition mechanisms that are designed by human beings to insulate them from a sense of undifferentiated irritability. In other words, a sea, and I've chosen that word advisedly, a sea of irritability, an ocean of annoyance. I'm just self-sharing now. But what normally happens is this primitive, undifferentiated irritability is overlaid by reflex irritability of a specific order. So reflex irritability, I'm thinking of examples. I think in technical terms it would be called something like somatic symptom conversion, which is another way of saying hysteria. Or if you, the two extreme forms of that would be, if you develop tics, it's your body's way of trying to deal with this excess of irritability, or the diametrically opposed thing would be paralysis, the opposite of a tic. You lose the ability to move because you haven't controlled this underlying undifferentiated irritability. And then the phrase, the psychically conditioned choice of reaction, that refers to things like unconscious affective dysregulation, and another way of saying that would be anger outbursts. So if you find yourself so you're in charge of the anger outburst, no one's forcing you in that sense to be angry, but people experience an uncontrolled rage. They have an anger outburst that takes themselves by surprise, and that is on the borderline between what we're in control of and what takes over us. And the mention of the fakir, the Indian guru type, they practiced developing trances that created states in which pain wasn't felt. So all of these are just showing how, in psychoanalytical terms, there are layers of our psychology that we place on our inner undifferentiated irritability. And at risk of belabouring the point, I'm just showing that Ahab, for all the fact people don't like him, in a certain interpretive sense, is just the unalloyed, unvarnished, undifferentiated irritability that we all contain. But in a certain sense, Ahab's just being more honest about it. And I'll just start finishing off with the concept of sleep. So coitus and sleep, and this is how the beginning of chapter 9 in Ferenczi is presented. So sleep's a shell to break and spurn. That's Faust part 2. And then I'm adding this because it just reminded me the classic from the to be or not to be soliloquy from Hamlet. To die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. So the profoundness of sleep, something that we all do, but most people don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about. And guess what? Ferenczi has his own theory about that. In my stages of development of the reality sense, the first sleep of the newborn, to which the careful isolation, the warm swaddling by, so this is a newly born baby, the warm swaddling by mother or nurse contribute, was described as a replica of the interuterine state. The child, frightened, crying, shaken by the traumatic experience of birth, soon becomes lulled in this sleeping state, which creates in him a feeling on a reality basis on the one hand, and on the other hallucinatorily, that is, illusorily, as though no such tremendous shock had occurred at all. Freud has said, indeed, that strictly speaking, the human being is not completely born. He is not born in the full sense, seeing that through going nightly to bed, he spends half his life in, as it were, the mother's womb. So right from the get-go, when you're born, the idea is that they're trying to compensate for the trauma by putting you back in a womb-like state, so you have your first sleep. And then Ferenczi and Freud are both saying, as adults, we still return to the state of sleep that is like the interuterine state. So at quite an important level, we're always in slight denial about our sense of reality, because on a daily basis, we all escape reality by going to sleep. And again, you know, how this relates to the importance of literature. Literature is another way of escaping the confines of reality, which in the context of this quote isn't necessarily escapist in the pejorative sense. Freud and Ferenczi here are describing how escape from reality is a completely natural, essential part of actual human life. Which begs the question, everyone is very familiar with the downsides of a lack of sleep. The consequences that has for things as diverse as gut health to, you know, mental health, and the way in which the brain repairs itself overnight and all these things. But if it's true that literature to some extent replicates that sleep state in the way in which it allows us to divest ourselves of explicit reality in a controlled way, it is an interesting question to ask when people stop reading, when people stop engaging with the best literature. Is there a cultural form of an effect vaguely similar to something you might term cultural insomnia? The sleeper, inasmuch as he hallucinatorily denies the disturbing environment in its entirety and concentrates his cathexis of physiological and psychic interests and attention upon the desire for repose, attains the goal of regression by an unreality and fantasy method almost exclusively. Whereas we're obliged to assert of coitus that it attained this goal in part in merely illusory fashion, in part in a reality sense, for the organ of copulation and the genital secretion do in very truth penetrate into the uterus. Sleep and coitus are therefore both the beginning and the end of the development towards erotic reality hitherto undergone. The sleeper is an auto-erotic. He represents in toto a child who is enjoying repose inside his mother's body and who, in his absolutely narcissistic absorption, is altogether indifferent to the environment. So there's two things here. There is regression by an unreality and fantasy method, so we regress to a womb-like state by a purely psychological route like sleeping, or I'm suggesting at a minor level like reading good literature. And then he says the sex act, coitus, is a combination of both in the sense that the physical reproductive act imitates returning to the womb. But on the other hand, if you think about it, there's a whole fantasy set up around the thing that leads to the sex act. So the whole whining and dining, the whole will she, won't she, will he, won't he? Well, I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. But the whole romantic tradition, this psychological, imaginative mode, the fantasy method, the after the honeymoon period quickly vanishes. But all of this is tied together. And that begs the question, if you think of the whole Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue type phenomena of modern times, they have completely lost the relationship between what's being described here, the reality sense. A healthy sense of reality normally combines both the unreality and fantasy method and a sense of reality. So in psychoanalytical terms, having a complete sense of reality only based upon pure reality is, in psychological terms, ironically, not a healthy thing to do. So Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips and these type of people, they've removed all fantasy. And what you're left with is this incredibly, ironically, unreal, quite disturbed approach. So the idea of the sleeper is not sleeper is a milder version. But it's an autoerotic. He represents in toto a child who's enjoying repose inside his mother's body. But it's interesting here, who in his absolutely narcissistic absorption is altogether indifferent to the environment. And I've emboldened this because the absolutely narcissistic absorption describes Captain Ahab. He's altogether indifferent to any of the environmental factors except those that will get him his wish fulfillment of encountering the white whale. So yes, he's incredibly manipulative of the people around him. He's not unconscious, but his consciousness of his environment is all subordinated to his narcissistic absorption and his main aim, the wish fulfillment of confronting the great white whale. So this concept of Ahab's monomania, and I'm just putting it out there, to what extent do we all share some aspects of Ahab's monomania? So characteristic of both phenomena, sleep and coitus, is the exclusion of external stimuli, the giving up of the life of relationships, the reduction of receptivity to stimuli, the abandoning of interest in every purpose except that which serves wish fulfillment. So this, from the character of Captain Ahab to real life people like Bonnie Blue, Lily Phillips, it's giving up of the life of relationships. Couldn't be a more accurate description of what Bonnie Blue and Lily Phillips have done. The reduction of receptivity to stimuli. The abandoning of interest in every purpose except that which serves wish fulfillment. I think this describes Ahab's monomania. But if we're not careful, it also describes our excessive focus. So then he goes on to develop, this is Ferenczi again, the close connection between sleep and hypnosis is familiar. On the other hand, psychoanalysis has had to take note of the complete identity of sexual and hypnotic relationships. So the whole notion of falling in love can be quite hypnotic. Psychotherapists often take advantage of a normal state of drowsiness to render their subjects compliant. And the parental command, go to sleep, has a definitely hypnotic effect upon the child. I don't agree with that, but I'll talk about that in a second. Continued deliberate interference with the normal need of sleep is instrumental in many religious sects in breaking the self-will of neophytes. Much as the falconer, with only the aid of constant prevention of sleep, induces in the bird of prey an obedience which makes it the servant, devoid of any will of its own, of its master. Clearly, the desire to sleep hallucinatorily, to retire in the face of fatiguing reality into intrauterine or still more archaic repose, is such an intense one that for its sake and in the interest of all the mental and physical forces are bent to this end in an exceptional degree. So this I think he's deluded if he thinks telling small children go to sleep has a hypnotic effect. Probably has the opposite effect. But what I would take from that is when it's bedtime for children, despite all the high-tech gadgets we have at hand, tell me in the comments if I'm wrong, but the most effective way to get a child to go to sleep, or a young child at least, is to tell them a story. So again, we're back to what literature can do as a hallucinatory way of dealing with reality in a positive, controlled way. But just the emboldened bit at the end, the desire to sleep hallucinatorily, to retire in the face of fatiguing reality. I've emboldened all this, the intensity that for its own sake and in its interest, all the mental and physical forces are bent to this end. This is a way of seeing Ahab's monomaniacal desire to confront the whale, and at the end he gets his desire to sleep. Tremner, a writer well versed in the physiology of sleep, in the introduction to his little book on sleep, has passages abounding in metaphors to which we attach much greater significance than does the author. Of waking from sleep, he says, thus arise light and life out of the lap of night and nothingness. But the night does not dismiss its creatures, for it holds fast to them, and ever and again compels them back to its silencing bosom. Daily we must return again to the bosom of all-nourishing night, in whose dark folds dwell the true nurturers of existence. So this concept of sleep as the lap of night and nothingness, the silencing bosom, so the nourishment of the mother again. But it's the all-nourishing night in whose dark folds dwell the true nurturers of existence. And there's nothing much darker and more night-like than the ocean sea, the ocean bottom, the depths of the ocean into which Ahab disappears at the very end. Ernst Tremner was a German, by the way, just for information, a German neurologist. And I think he was the one who invented the reflex hammer, when you do that reflex test when they whack you on the kneecap with a hammer. Right, so to start really wrapping up, I'm just going to finish with a little bit more from Ferenczi and then tie all this into Captain Ahab's watery end. The tendency to regression, which governs both psychic and organic life, as Freud has already laid down in his theory of the instincts, it is as though behind the facade which the descriptive statements of biology supply us, there continue to exist and operate as the biological unconscious, so to speak, the form of activity and the mode of organisation characteristic of apparently long superseded stages in the development of the individual and the species. So this idea that it's been a theme throughout the book Thalassa by Ferenczi, but this Freudian idea that at the end, at the bottom of all the social and psychological facades that we put in the way between us and reality, there's this biological unconscious that stems way, way back. And again, is why I think literature is so important, is why a book like Moby Dick is so powerful, is that I think great authors are able to put into symbols some of these atavistic, some of these, all the things I've been describing and Ferenczi's arguing is long superseded stages in the development of the individual and the species. So ontogenetically, the things that happen to us when we're in the womb are ontogenetic desire to return to the womb. So I don't know why I'm zooming in and out. that's what great literature, to some extent, it's describing with Ahab. But then there's also the species, the way in which we came from the sea, and the great white whale covers that angle. The great white whale in Moby Dick is almost representative of the phylogenetic, the species, and our evolutionary history, and Captain Ahab is representative of the ontogenetic, the individual organism and their experience of life. So having always in mind Goethe's ominous lines, all forms evolve according to eternal laws, and in the most divergent shapes is hid the archetype. A not less significant, although at first blush certainly very surprising, methodological departure which we've permitted ourselves in this work has been the utilisation of symbolism as a source of knowledge in the sphere of natural science. By conceiving of the symbols which can be analytically recognised as such in the content of the psyche, by conceiving of these as not the fortuitous and sportive expression of fantasy activity, but rather the historically significant traces of repressed biological situations, one can scarcely predict how much unconscious wisdom lies concealed in the naive traditions of folklore, of Märchen, and of myths, and in particular in the luxuriant symbolism of dreams. Märchen in German is fairy stories. But this is what I was getting at all the way through to culminate at this point. Ferenczi talks in terms of symbolism, but I think you could extend that to literature in general. Great works like Moby Dick are able to express what Ferenczi here calls the historically significant traces of repressed biological situations. So great literature represents unconscious wisdom. So now to finish appropriately enough on the cheery topic of death and the agony of our final moments. To us physicians, the death agony, as indeed its name conveys, never presents a serene or peaceful countenance. Even the organism scarcely any longer capable of life usually makes exodus with the death struggle. So they refer to the death rattle, don't they, the noise people make. Perhaps only in our wishful conceptions, themselves governed by the death instinct, is there such a thing as a natural, gentle death, an untroubled and tranquil manifestation of the death instinct. For in reality, it seems as though life had always to end catastrophically, even as it began in birth with a catastrophe. It would indeed seem as though there were discoverable in the symptoms of the death struggle regressive trends which might fashion dying in the image of birth and so render it less agonizing. I just think this, so Ferenczi is talking about the agony of our final moments, which hopefully I will avoid by ocean-like industrial amounts of Nigerian Guinness. So life had always to end catastrophically. I aim to end it laughing, giggling, manically. But if on a serious note, all of this actually could be seen as an explanation or a partial justification for Ahab's end. If life had always to end catastrophically, well, Ahab really takes it to the nth degree. Immediately before the individual breathes his last, often indeed somewhat sooner, complete resignation supervenes, nay, expressions of satisfaction which proclaim the final attainment of a state of perfect rest, somewhat as in orgasm after the sexual struggle which has preceded it. Sexual struggle is not exactly Barry White method, is it? Death exhibits utero-regressive trends similar to those of sleep and coitus. So remember this also, the final attainment of a state of perfect rest, somewhat as in orgasm after the sexual struggle which has preceded it. I'll finish by showing you a couple of quotes from the very end of Ahab's death, which I'd argue is Ahab struggles throughout against the great white whale. And in some senses, his death is portrayed as an orgasmic finality. So this is the very final chapter, if you exclude the epilogue. So this is Ahab. O lonely death on lonely life, O now I feel my topmost greatness lies in my topmost grief. Ho, ho, from all your furthest bounds, pour ye now in, ye bold billows of my whole foregone life, and top this one, piled coma of my death. Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee, from hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. Sink all coffins and all hearses to one common pool. And since neither can be mine, let me then tow to pieces while still chasing thee, though tied to thee, thou damned whale. Thus I give up the spear. So I'd argue there's orgasmic connotations all the way through. I spit my last breath at thee. I give up the spear. The harpoon was darted, the stricken whale flew forward. With igniting velocity the line ran through the groove, ran foul. Ahab stooped to clear it. He did clear it, but the flying turn caught him around the neck, and voicelessly as Turkish mutes bowstring their victim, he was shot out of the boat ere the crew knew he was gone. Next instant, the heavy eye splice in the rope's final end flew out of the stark empty tub, knocked down an oarsman, and, smiting the sea, disappeared in its depths. So he was shot out of the boat, ejaculated out of the boat, and disappeared in the interuterine depths of the receptacle of the ocean. Yes, I'm exhausted now. I need a cigarette. But that, I hope, gives some indication of how you could apply psychoanalytical theory to Moby Dick and how far in advance ahead of its time it was. I just think there are so many implicit psychoanalytical concepts that Melville intuitively gathered that Ferenczi and Freud it took later on to systematize. But more importantly, I think the one thing I'd ask you to take away from this is the idea that literature, this positive hallucinatory method of dealing with reality, if it is true that at some primeval atavistic level, we're all struggling to get back into the womb, there are worse ways to try and find that inner sense of calm than just reading a good book. So I hope you enjoy that. Till the next time, all the very best. Take care.